Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at catching criminals, 19th century law enforcement. The focus here is going to be on the Bow Street runners and the early police forces. Firstly, some background. What was the situation in the early 18th century? Policing was fairly informal before the 19th century, but there were some officials to try and keep the peace. One of these was the parish constable. These dealt with petty crime, begging and disorder, mostly in rural areas. However, you would find them in the towns too. They appointed watchmen. These were organised to protect private property, particularly in the towns where there was a concentration of businesses and such property to protect. And also there were part-time soldiers or militia. These were called up in local areas to deal with riots and rebellions where and when they were needed. In addition to this, the growing towns and cities employed constables and watchmen who were actually paid a salary, giving them a bit more in common with an actual police force. However, the pay and status was low, so there was little trust that they were free from corruption. Often people were slightly uncomfortable with how close they were to the criminals they were supposed to be apprehending. So how did this change? The Bow Street Runners. The Bow Street Runners were a group intended for catching criminals established in London in 1748, and we'll notice a pattern here. Many of the early developments do happen in London. The Chief Magistrate of the time, Henry Fielding, wanted to improve law and order, and he had offices on Bow Street. That's where the name comes from. Fielding recognised that thief takers could have a useful role in enforcing the law, but that they needed better regulation and monitoring to make them more effective and improve their questionable reputation with the public. He placed an advertisement in the Covent Garden Journal advertising for suitable men to become principal officers. In 1754, Fielding's brother, John, took over the offices, who became known as the Bow Street Runners. So how effective were the Bow Street Runners? What was their impact? At first, the Bow Street Runners offered their services for a price or by collecting reward money to pay for their offices. However, by 1785 they were paid directly by the government. This made the Bow Street Runners the first modern detective force. This way of enforcing the law was innovative for a number of reasons. Firstly, deterrence. Being more likely to be caught put potential criminals off breaking the law in the first place. Also their organisation. There were regular planned patrols on foot and on horseback along major roads and routes. This is the birth of bobbies on the beach, you might say. And information. They collected and shared intelligence about cases and suspects between officers and with other law enforcers. The Bow Street office became a centre or a hub for detection and law enforcement. Similar offices in Westminster and Middlesex followed, with paid officers dealing with crime on their patch. In the Bow Street Runners, we can maybe recognise the very origins of police forces, but it's not as simple as that. There was some opposition to creating organised police forces. Some felt that this was an infringement on freedoms and privacy. Others doubted the effectiveness of such officers, but perhaps most didn't want to have to pay for such officers. However, over time, the Bow Street Runners and similar detective forces showed that they were effective, but they were too few in number. The Metropolitan Police Act of 1829 was a turning point. It authorised the creation of a professional police force, in London at least, and indeed at most. It divided London into 17 districts, each with 4 inspectors and 144 constables to enforce the law and detect crime. This made it bigger and better organised than the Bow Street Runners, and regular patrols or beats both deterred and detected crime at the same time. The Metropolitan Police Force had shown that it could be effective, but its ideas were fairly slow to spread. We're going to consider the reasons why now. Home Secretary Robert Peel was keen to distinguish police officers from the army, but also to encourage people to respect and trust them. Now, this wasn't something that was automatic. Part of his solution was a distinctive dark navy blue uniform with top hats to offer protection and recognisability. Now, this was a difficult balance to tread. The uniforms need to be distinctive but also smart enough to show the authority of the role. But also they need to be completely different from the army uniforms to show that they were not the same thing as the army. So a dark navy blue was considered to be very different from the red of the army. However, some people were still suspicious that the police force were there to oppress them and put down protests. The idea was slow to spread outside of London because of cost. Ratepayers or taxpayers refused to fund professional police forces. Also, a lack of cooperation. What forces there were did not communicate effectively with one another. But also, a lack of compulsion. The government allowed policing to be a local issue, so local authorities weren't forced to create them. This arguably led to a series of false starts. Efforts to spread professional policing outside of London had, frankly, mixed success. One early law was the 1835 Municipal Corporations Act. This gave borough councils the powers to set up professional policing, but concerns over cost meant that only 93 out of 171 boroughs had done so by 1837. Then came the 1839 Rural Constabulary Act. This allowed all 54 counties the power to organise a paid police force at a rate of 1 constable per 1,000 of the population. The justices of the peace in the area were responsible for appointing a chief constable to coordinate efforts, but only 36 out of 54 had done so by 1850. The key weakness was that these laws allowed or gave the power to set up police forces, but they did not compel or force authorities to do so. At the time, there was laissez-faire government. This means basically do nothing. Most people, especially taxpayers, believed that it was not the government's right to interfere in most people's ordinary day-to-day lives. But an increasingly connected and sophisticated society showed that this was often necessary. So these acts, which allowed the local areas to set up these things, often found that people simply didn't want to, and so they needed to be forced. All of this led to the 1856 Police Act. The passing of the 1856 Police Act made all areas introduce a professional police force, along the model of the Metropolitan Police. This was the start of the modern police force. The principle of deterrence through detection had been shown to work in areas with efficient police forces, so government officials inspected forces to ensure that government funds were being spent appropriately. This was followed by the creation of the National Crime Records in 1869, which allowed police forces all over the country to rapidly share information about criminals across the country. As it became easier for criminals to move, so it became easier for police and information to move too. This was made possible by technology, particularly the railways and the telegraph, which allowed virtually instant messaging. With uniformed constables on the beat, out on the streets deterring and detecting crime, there was a need for a separate pure investigations organisation. Some rich people were already employing private investigators, think Sherlock Holmes here, but for ordinary people this simply wasn't an option. As early as 1842, a regular detective branch was set up based in Scotland Yard in London, where famously the Metropolitan Police remains based to this day. They specialised in investigating crimes rather than patrolling on the beat and deterring crime. As such, they did not wear the police uniform. Quite the opposite, they didn't want to stand out. Some people were distrustful of plainclothes officers, fearing that they were basically state-employed spies. In 1878, the Criminal Investigations Department, or CID, was founded. CID employed 200 detectives, but by 1883 there were 600. They tried to be innovative and used novel ways of getting clues and solving crimes. In the 1880s, they unsuccessfully tried to unmask Jack the Ripper using analysis of handwritten notes. Then in 1902, they successfully convicted a burglar by identifying fingerprints at the crime scene, something that became pretty standard practice after that point. So now there were bobbies on the beat deterring and detecting crime day to day, and there were people dedicated to the pure investigation and detection of crime and trying to solve the unsolved. To sum up, in the 18th century, most areas relied on a combination of parish constables, watchmen and part-time soldiers to deal with crime and unrest. From 1748, the Bow Street runners operated in London as paid law enforcement officers. They had some success and were government funded from 1785. This idea led to the creation of a professional police force with the Metropolitan Police Act in 1829, so that was London's first professional police force. The 1835 Municipal Corporations Act gave local government the powers to set up similar police forces elsewhere, but few did. The 1839 Rural Constabulary Act did the same at a county level, but again, few did. The 1856 Police Act forced local authorities to set up police forces, along similar lines to the Metropolitan Police. The National Crime Records and creation of CID in 1878 made the sharing of information and detection of crime more effective than ever. The aim was for uniformed police to be a trusted enforcer of the law through deterrence and detection, but some doubts over freedoms, privacy and cost persisted. That's the end of this rapid revision video. I hope it's been useful to you. If it has, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. Got another topic you want me to cover? Pop it in the comments below. For now, goodbye.